door of the balcony was hermetically sealed for the winter. The balcony door and two of the windows looked out on an alley that ran into the distance, with its sleigh tracks and the irregular line of its houses and fences. Purple shadows reached into the room from the garden. The trees, laden with hoarfrost, their branches like smoky streaks of candle wax, looked in as if they wished to rest their burden on the floor of the study. Nikolai Nikolaevich stood gazing into the distance. He thought of his last winter in Petersburg, Gapon, Gorky, the visit to Prime Minister Witt, modern, fashionable writers. From that bedlam he had fled to the peace and quiet of the ancient capital to write the book he had in mind. But he had jumped out of the frying pan into the fire. Lectures, everyday university courses for women, the Religious Philosophical Society, the Red Cross and the Strike Fund, not a moment to himself. What he needed was to get away to Switzerland, to some remote canton in the woods, to the peace of lakes, mountains, sky, and the echoing, ever-responsive air. Nikolai Nikolaevich turned away from the window. He felt like going out to call on someone or just to walk about the streets, but he remembered that Vyvoloknov, the Tolstoyan, was coming to see him about some business or other. He paced up and down the room, his thoughts turning to his nephew. When Nikolai Nikolaevich had moved from his retreat on the Volga to Petersburg, he had left Yurii in Moscow, where he had many relatives: the Vladimir Pins, the Ostromeslenskys, the Selyevans, the Mikhaileses, the Sventitskys, and the Gromykovs. At first Yurii was foisted on the slovenly old chatterbox Ostromeslensky, known among the clan as Fedka. Fedka lived in sin with his ward Motia and therefore saw himself as a disruptor of the established order and a champion of progressive thought. He did not justify his kinsman's confidence, and even took the money given him for Yurii's upkeep and spent it on himself. Yurii was transferred to the professorial family of the Gromykovs and was still with them. The atmosphere at the Gromykovs was eminently suitable, Nikolai Nikolaevich thought. They had their daughter, Tonia, who was Yurii's age, and Misha Gordon, who was Yurii's friend and classmate, living with them. And a comical triumvirate they make, thought Nikolai Nikolaevich. The three of them had soaked themselves in the meaning of love and the Kreutzer Sonata and had a mania for preaching chastity. It was right, of course, for adolescents to go through a frenzy of purity, but they were overdoing it a bit. They had lost all sense of proportion. How childish and eccentric they were. For some reason, they called the domain of the sensual, which disturbed them so much, vulgar, and used the expression in and out of place. A most ineptly chosen term. Vulgar was applied to instinct, to pornography, to exploitation of women, and almost to the whole physical world. They blushed or grew pale when they pronounced the word. If I had been in Moscow, thought Nikolai Nikolaevich, I would not have let it go so far. Modesty is necessary, but within limits. Nil Feoktistovich, come in, he exclaimed, going out to meet his visitor. A fat man in a grey Tolstoyan shirt with a broad leather belt, felt boots, and trousers bagging at the knees entered the room. He looked like a good soul with his head in the clouds. A pince nez on a wide black ribbon quivered angrily on his nose. He had begun to take his things off in the hall, but had not removed his scarf and came in with it trailing on the floor and his round felt hat still in his hand. These encumbrances prevented him from shaking hands with Nikolai Nikolaevich, and even from saying how do you do. He mooed helplessly, looking around the room. Put him down anywhere, said Nikolai Nikolaevich, restoring Vyvoloknov's power of speech and self-possession. Here was one of those followers of Tolstoy in whom the ideas of the genius who had never known peace had settled down to enjoy a long, unclouded rest, growing hopelessly shallow in the process. He had come to ask Nikolai Nikolaevich to speak at a meeting in aid of political deportees that was to be held at some school or other. "I've spoken at that school already. In aid of our exiles." "Yes. You'll have to do it again." Nikolai Nikolaevich balked a little and then gave in. The business dealt with, Nikolai Nikolaevich did not attempt to delay his guest. Nil Feoktistovich could have left at once, but he evidently felt that it would be unseemly and was looking for something lively and natural to say by way of parting. The conversation became strained and awkward. "So you've become a decadent? Going in for mysticism? What do you mean? It's a waste, you know. Do you remember the county council?" "Of course. Didn't we canvass for it together? And we did some good work fighting for the village schools and teachers' colleges. Remember?" "Of course. It was a splendid battle. And then you became interested in public health and social welfare, didn't you?" "For a time, yes." And now it's all this highbrow stuff, fauns and nenuphars and ephebes and the lesbi like the sun. I can't believe it. Bless me if I can, an intelligent man like you, and with your sense of humor and your knowledge of the people. Come, now. Or am I intruding into the Holy of Holies? Why all this talk? What are we arguing about? You don't know my ideas. Russia needs schools and hospitals, not fauns and nenuphars. No one denies it. The peasants are in rags and famished. So the conversation dragged on. Knowing how useless it was, Nikolai Nikolaevich tried nevertheless to explain what attracted him to some of the writers of the symbolist school. Then, turning to Tolstoy and doctrines, he said, "Up to a point I am with you. But Tolstoy says that the more a man devotes himself to beauty, the further he moves away from goodness. And you think it's the other way round, the world will be saved by beauty, is that it? Dostoevsky, Rozanov, mystery plays, and what not. Wait, let me tell you what I think. I think that if the beast who sleeps in man could be held down by threats, any kind of threat, whether of jail or of retribution after death, then the highest emblem of humanity would be the lion tamer in the circus with his whip, not the prophet who sacrificed himself. But don't you see, this is just the point. What has for centuries raised man above the beast is not the cudgel but an inward music. The irresistible power of unarmed truth, the powerful attraction of its example. It has always been assumed that the most important things in the Gospels are the ethical maxims and commandments. But for me the most important thing is that Christ speaks in parables taken from life, that he explains the truth in terms of everyday reality. The idea that underlies this is that communion between mortals is immortal, and that the whole of life is symbolic because it is meaningful. I haven't understood a word. You should write a book about it. After Vyvoloknov had left, Nikolai Nikolaevich felt extremely cross. He was angry with himself for having blurted out some of his most intimate thoughts to that fool, without impressing him in the least. Then his annoyance, as sometimes happens, changed its target. He recalled another incident. He did not keep a diary, but once or twice a year he would record in a thick notebook some thought which struck him particularly. He got out the notebook now and began to write in a large, legible hand. This is what he wrote. Upset all day by that silly Schlesinger woman. She came in the morning, stayed till lunchtime, and for 2 solid hours bored me reading out that gibberish, a libretto in verse by the Symbolista to the cosmogonic symphony by the composer B with the spirits of the planets, voices of the 4 elements, etc., etc. I listened with impatience, Then I couldn't stand it and begged her to stop. And suddenly I understood everything. I understood why this stuff is so deadly, so insufferably false, even in Faust. The whole thing is artificial. No one is genuinely interested in it. Modern man has no need of it. When he is overcome by the mysteries of the universe, he turns to physics, not to Hesiod's hexameters. And it isn't just that the form is an anachronism, or that these spirits of earth and air only confuse what science has unraveled. The fact is that this type of art is wholly out of keeping with the spirit, the essence, the motivating force of contemporary art. These cosmogonies were natural in the ancient world, a world settled so sparsely that nature was not yet eclipsed by man. Mammoths still walked the earth. Dragons and dinosaurs were still fresh in people's memory. Nature hit you in the eye so plainly and grabbed you so fiercely and so tangibly by the scruff of the neck that perhaps it really was still full of gods. Those were the first pages of the chronicle of mankind. It was only just beginning. This ancient world ended with Rome, because of overpopulation. Rome was a flea market of borrowed gods and conquered peoples, a bargain basement on 2 floors, earth and heaven, a mass of filth convoluted in a triple knot as in an intestinal obstruction. Dacians, Herulians, Scythians, Sarmatians, Hyperboreans, heavy wheels without spokes, eyes sunk in fat, sodomy, double chins, illiterate emperors, fish fed on the flesh of learned slaves. There were more people in the world than there have ever been since, all crammed into the passages of the Colosseum, and all wretched. And then, into this tasteless heap of gold and marble, he came, light and clothed in an aura. Emphatically human, deliberately provincial, Galilean. And at that moment gods and nations ceased to be and man came into being, man the carpenter, man the plowman, man the shepherd with his flock of sheep at sunset, man who does not sound in the least proud, man thankfully celebrated in all the cradle songs of mothers and in all the picture galleries the world over. 11 The Petrovka looked like a corner of Petersburg in Moscow, with its matching houses on both sides of the street, the tastefully sculptured house entrances, the bookshop, the library, the cartographers, the elegant tobacco shop, the excellent restaurant, its front door flanked by 2 gaslights in round frosted shades on massive brackets. In winter the street frowned with a forbidding surliness. Its inhabitants were solid, self-respecting, prosperous members of the liberal professions. Here Viktor Ippolitovich Komarovsky rented his magnificent 3rd-floor apartment, reached by a wide staircase with massive oak banisters. His housekeeper, or rather the chatelaine of his quiet retreat, Emma Ernestovna, took care of everything without meddling in his private life. She ran the place unseen and unheard. He repaid her with the nightly delicacy to be expected of so fine a gentleman, and never tolerated visitors, male or female, whose presence would have disturbed her peaceful, spinsterish world. A monastic stillness reigned in their home. The blinds were drawn, and everything was spotlessly clean, as in an operating room. On Sunday mornings Viktor Ippolitovich, accompanied by his bulldog, usually took a leisurely walk down the Petrovka and along Kuznetsky Most, and at one of the street corners they were joined by the actor and gambler Konstantin Illarionovich Satanidy. They walked together along Kuznetsky Most, telling each other dirty stories, snorting with contempt, and laughing shamelessly in deep, loud voices that filled the air with sounds no more significant than the howling of a dog. 12 The weather was on the mend. Plop 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 went the water drops on the metal of the drain pipes and the cornices, roof tapping messages to roof as if it were spring. It was thawing. Lara walked all the way in a daze and realized what had happened to her only when she reached home. Everyone was asleep. She fell back into her trance and in this abstracted state sat down at her mother's dressing table. Still in her pale mauve, almost white, lace-trimmed dress and long veil borrowed for the evening from the workshop, like a costume. She sat before her reflection in the mirror, and saw nothing. Then, folding her arms, she put them on the dressing table and buried her head in them. If Mother learned about it, she would kill her. She would kill her and then she would kill herself. How had it happened? How could it possibly have happened? It was too late now. She should have thought of it earlier. Now she was, what was it called? A fallen woman. She was a woman out of a French novel.